Hello, how you doing, Psych and Law? Alright guys, let us then move on to lecture 3. This is the theories of crime. And, I think one of the important take-home points when we move through this lecture is when we observe crime and we want to explain the causes of crime, we have multiple potential causal explanations. And all of them, or some of them, might be actual effective explanations. Part of becoming a good critical thinker is, again, being able to list these are the possible causes, and then once I have a list of possible causes, I search for the evidence that supports or refutes the causes. So we go from a list of causes to generating hypotheses to then determining what data we need to either support or refute those causes, and then we can begin to come to conclusions. But the conclusions may never be final. We might say, wow, this is the most likely reason for what I observed, but there's 2 or 3 other potential reasons, just less likely. But in this individual case, we might find that one of the less likely explanations actually is the best explanation for this specific context. For social psychologists, we're comfortable with that kind of thinking. For a lot of other people who want to live in a black and white world, that is a struggle to wrap one's head around it. So let's talk about theories of crime. And this, like the dilemmas, is fair game throughout the course. We don't get to leave this behind because throughout the course we can generate explanations for what we're talking about from different potential theories of crime. So let's begin, though, talking about crime rates in the United States. And if we want to study crime rates in the United States, one of the places we can go to for that information is the FBI Uniform Crime Reporting Mechanism. That's the UCR. And what the UCR does is it taps into local law enforcement. So local law enforcement sends their crime statistics to the FBI, and the FBI then compiles. It operates as a data clearinghouse in this regard. So how does it work? Well, the FBI then classifies crimes into crime categories, and it tabulates the data within those categories. So, for example, violent crimes, the FBI say, includes murder, non-negligent manslaughter, forcible rape, aggravated assault, robbery as some examples, not an inclusive list, entirely inclusive. Property crimes would be thought to be burglary, larceny, theft, motor vehicle theft, arson. But arson, man, keeps going back and forth, and people don't necessarily know where to pin down arson. Obviously, someone could die as a result of an arson, or it could be merely property damage. So arson kind of straddles the fence and goes back and forth. Now, from 2012, we've all had to live with this transition for those of us who study this. The National Incident-Based Reporting System has been transitioning from 2012 to present. One thing it does is it kind of complicates our view then of the FBI's data because they're changing the game, so to speak. They're changing how they compile the data, how they qualify the data, and how they categorize the data. So, but that's okay. We can deal with that. Now, how many of you operate under the general perception that crime is on the increase? And think about it. A lot of politicians want to tell us, hey, crime's on the increase. Crime's out of control. We need to do this. We need to do that, right? Actually, strangely enough, since the 1990s, crime, for the most part, has been on the general decline, right? And so one of the things when we step back is people might tell us that crime is on the increase, but when we look at the actual data, it doesn't support what they're telling us. And of course, for me, I always, ever since I was a child, question authority was the name of the game. So then I question authority and I say, well, why are they telling me something that isn't true? And the fact that governments or people in government lie should be no mystery. I think we've had ample evidence of that over the long haul and certainly in the recent past. So what we do is the estimated number of offenses, right, 5-year trend from 2008 to 2012, we see this precipitous drop, right, in the violent crime offense figures. And if we look at it from 2014, let's say, to 2018, we see in 2014 we've had an increase and then we've had a decrease. Problem is, this leads to some significant differences when we look at it. When we look at this chart, and this is where statistics come in to help us out, that these differences, although it looks like something is happening, many of these differences aren't really significant. In fact, these last 3 data points are essentially the same when you get right down to it. There's no meaningful difference to be detected there. So we see that violent crime has increased, albeit not very much in the last couple of years. Is that increase enough to warrant changing one's responses? And that becomes one of the issues to consider within the context of these situations. So we look at the data and we try to make data-based decisions. You can check this out yourself, so you can go ahead, you can hit this link and you can go to the FBI website. You can look at all the different data. It allows you to download data files so you can do analysis. The FBI really does a lot to contribute to the academic understanding of crime. And then you can look at locality, you can look at crime. They slice and dice the data in so many different ways. For example, let's just look at this murder by weapon, right? And this is from 2008 to 2018. In 2018, I update these statistics about every 2 or 3 years. I don't make them fresh every year. It's kind of a time-consuming process. And actually, there is no 2020 data yet, right? So the best data that exists right now is going to be 2019, and even that data hasn't necessarily been verified. So usually the most accurate analysis of the statistics is 2 to 3 years old. So what do we know, though? And just to get a general sense, when we look murder by weapon, so it tells us total firearms deaths. We see in 2008, 9,500, 2009, 9,100, all the way to 2016. And this is where it gets strange in the data reporting. It's changed how they're presenting the data quite a bit, so we need to better understand the changes that have taken place. But let us then extract, at least from 2008 to 2010, what can we learn? Total firearms. Firearms are used in homicide above and beyond all the other types combined. And what type of firearm? Handguns. Handguns are the weapon of choice. Compare 2008. The number of deaths by handgun is 6,800. The number of deaths by rifle is 380. Now, if we then say we should ban assault rifles, and you say, okay, but needs assessment, program design, program evaluation, if you use a data-driven approach, say, boy, if we're interested in reducing murders, then maybe handguns are the place where we might want to focus our attention rather than rifles, right? But notice, when we have someone who uses an assault rifle, goes into a school, and I'm not trying to minimize this, that's an absolutely tragic occurrence to see 24, 32 children killed, right, in a single event by someone wielding an assault rifle. It causes us all to pay attention because the spectacular nature of the offense and the unconscionable violation and the horrible loss of life that's involved. But we can see that rifles account for the smallest proportion of murders by firearm. And certainly we can say, well, why is that? Well, obviously it's difficult to carry a rifle necessarily without being observed. A handgun can be secreted in all different locations on the body. Now, but you say, okay, but boy, if states convert to this open carry kind of mechanism, then we're able to carry rifles and we might be noticed, but we're not in violation of the law. So again, changing laws, understanding laws becomes an incredibly complex process. But I hope that we come at it from a data-driven analysis, right, as much as anything. Now, let's look at other guns, whatever that means. Firearms, type not stated, is a relatively large category, which could cause some distortion of the relationship up above. Knives or cutting instruments, right, 1,800. That's still quite a few when you think about it. Blunt objects, clubs, hammers, etc. account for 603 murders in 2008 and 875 murders, personal weapons being hands, fists, feet, or etc. But again, we have a tremendous amount of information, and that's what these charts are about. And then major cities in the United States, their statistics are represented by the FBI as well. And here's for Columbus. And you can see the number of violent crimes in Columbus. I've only gone through 2010 here. I don't know what to say about the violent crime figures that we're observing. Property crimes. And interestingly, as the economy tanked, property crimes went largely down. And that's very strange because historically, as the economy gets worse, property crimes, especially like burglary, tend to go up. And we haven't observed that, and we have to step back and wonder why. And when we ask that question why, we can generate several testable hypotheses and see which holds water, so to speak. The FBI Crime Reporting Index, when considering 5 10-year trends, the 2018 estimate violent crime total is 4.7% above 2014 level, but 9% below 2009. Right? There's an estimated 368.9 violent crimes per 100,000 inhabitants, which is often the way they look at this proportionally, and a rate that fell 3.9 when compared to 2017. Right? So what we see, and these are then kind of interpretive narratives that are implied by the statistics that the FBI will share with us. But overall, the deal is, I don't care what you're being told that crime is going up. It ain't. It's going down over long-term trends. So 1990s was kind of a peak of criminal activity in the United States. So crime's going down. Is it good news? Given that the crime rate's going down, it's mostly going down. The big question for us from a psychological perspective is, do you feel safer? And if you don't feel safer, but the numbers indicate that probably you should feel safer, then why the hell don't we feel safer? Which is a whole nother series of questions to be answered, right? So is crime rate going down? Do we feel safer? Well, maybe, but maybe not. And we have to then understand, well, if the rate's going down, but we feel less safe, you know, it could be just an artifact of sensational news. The news sensationalizes severe crimes, and we think it's worse and worse. But crime may be perceived to be occurring in environments where it's not typically occurred before. Notice, a lot of countries, a lot of governments, you know, crime, if it's going up in the poor areas, in the ghettos, etc., it really doesn't affect the rest of us if it stays there. So it's not much of a concern, and I continue to feel safe. But if crime is starting to enter the workplace in greater and greater numbers, or crime is a feature of the schools, and notice that's a big thing that's driving our perception, right? When we think about Cho and we think about Virginia Tech, Cho goes into Virginia Tech with 2 handguns, not a rifle, multiple magazines, and he manages to kill 30-some people. We historically felt safe in school. And Cho, as an individual, has shattered that sense of safety for the rest of the country. And it really never occurred to us that things like the crimes that he committed could happen. And how did they happen? And it may just be a one-up, but we found in school shootings it's not. That there's many people who target schools specifically because they had in the past what police might call or represent soft targets. Different communities, right? So if the crime is increasing in Upper Arlington, you can bet your damn dollar that people are going to be motivated to do something about it. If crime is increasing over here in the Hilltop, maybe not so much because, you know, or in the Bottoms, that's where crime, or in East Columbus, there's a lot of crime there all the time anyway, right? So it might change our perceptions depending on the different communities, right? But the locations, like when Holmes goes into the theater in Colorado, right, and lays waste to dozens of people, then we stand up and take notice. And it also indicates to us about our vulnerability. And a place like a classroom or in a movie theater, there's an amazing level of vulnerability, right? Yeah. And I will say this, as being a range master for 6 years and training extensively, a lot of people say, well, the solution is, you know, good guys with guns. And that's been a big one in the news for the past couple of years, good guys with guns. Well, let me tell you, as a range master, my greatest fear as a range master was someone is going to come up to shoot at the range, and let's say it's a nice busy day, let's say it's a Saturday when I got like 50, 60 rifle shooters out there, and I got some guy who comes up to the window, checks in to go shooting, pays their money, heads down the rifle line, and then decides he's going to turn around and start shooting everybody up. It was my greatest fear ever, and I and the employees trained specifically for this, but I want you to consider what's necessary. That is, let's suppose we have someone who's in the middle of 40 or 50 people and then decides to stand up and start shooting them. This person has to be stopped from shooting those people. That's kind of a slam dunk. We know that has to happen. But the idea is from 10, 15, 20 yards away, can you stop that person without injuring anybody else? What level of skill does that take? What level of practice? Now, my two buddies on the SWAT team, John and Larry, who were trainers for LAPD SWAT, they trained, because this is what they did, especially hostage rescue was their specialty. They trained on the order of 2 or 3 times a week. That is, they're actually, shooting targets obscured by hostage targets 2 to 3 times a week to develop what they consider a level of skill to safely stop the attacker but not injure the bystanders. So people say, well, good guy with a gun. So if we all carry our guns into the movie theater, it'll all be okay because we'll take out the bad guy. And I'm like, no, that's not going to happen because these people aren't well trained. They maybe go to the range once a month. And they don't shoot in configurations where hostage targets, indicate that you missed and you harmed someone. It takes a lot of effort, and it takes a lot of training, and it takes a tremendous level of rehearsal and discipline. So the argument a good guy with a gun is the panacea, the more people we arm, the better off we'll be, is not supported by the evidence, because most people are not willing to train to that extent, right? So all these statistics and all this news media, etc., let's consider then kind of the relationship. Statistics tell us what happened, right? But what this lecture is about, and I'm sure what many of you have come to this class for, right, is the causes of crime that are the real interest. That is, why do people do this? Why did Holmes go into that theater, right? Why did Cho go into Virginia Tech? Why did Sandy Hook occur? Again and again and again, we have to ask the question, why? That's what we want to know, right? But there's multiple causes of crime, and that's what this lecture is about. Also, we have to consider, what are the antecedent conditions? And that means what sets the stage for criminal behavior or a criminal event, right? Are there early indicators? Are there things that we can see in people early on that might warn us to intervene? Okay? And what are the developmental processes in our society that actually propel people to commit a crime, right? I mean, little infants, little babies don't commit crime. So how do they grow up? How do they become adolescents to commit crime? What in the developmental process facilitates the likelihood that someone will commit a crime? And what are the maintenance factors? Once someone has become a criminal, why do they necessarily remain a criminal? What facilitates the continued demonstration of criminal behaviors, right? So not only do we have multiple causes to consider, but the process through which these causal mechanisms operate, right? So they're varying explanatory importance according to various theories of crime. So various theories of crime look at it differently and offers explanations in different contexts that are more or less useful. Now, again, let's return to this notion of statistics, and I want to give you one perspective on statistics, and that will come to us from Joseph Stalin, right? And Stalin, of course, was the leader of the Soviet Union from the late 20s through the 1950s. He shepherded the Soviet Union successfully through World War II. The death of one man is a tragedy, right? The death of millions is simply a statistic. Now, this is a hard one to attribute to Stalin. It's attributed, but we don't necessarily know that he said this precisely. The books I've read tend to support it in Stalin. But, of course, what can we say about Stalin? Stalin has more deaths to his credit than probably any human being in the history of our planet. Right? Stalin was a Georgian, and he became the leader of the Soviet Union because of his absolute ruthlessness, was so appreciated by Lenin. I love history too, right? And Stalin had a big beef against the Ukraine, and he systematically caused the starvation of 7 million, 8 million Ukrainians during the 1930s. This is a man who is absolutely ruthless and had no compunction about killing literally millions of people. His people, if you will, but they weren't. They were Ukrainians, not Georgians. So he felt justified in doing that. So. And think about, you heard of this guy named Vladimir Putin? Big fan of Stalin, right? Where was the Olympics held in Russia under Putin's regime? In Sochi? Sochi was the place that Stalin vacationed. And so the relationship of Putin, you know, if people say, oh, Putin's a cool guy, let's rethink that, okay? Anyone who's telling you Putin's a good guy is probably in Putin's pocket. I'm sorry, but Putin is a tough bastard, and he deserves to be respected, and he deserves to be feared. When did Putin grow up? Putin grew up in post-World War II Leningrad, which was under siege, and over 1 million people died at the hands of the Nazis in Leningrad. Putin is a hard ass. Putin is a hard ass in a way that most of us can't even imagine how to become a hard ass. So to think that we can go one-on-one when Bush, you know, Jr. said, hey, I looked in Putin's eyes and I saw into his soul. Sorry, Charlie, not quite. Putin can eat up most government leaders and spit them out in a heartbeat. So, Stalin light, if you will. Let's talk about the theories of crime. We're going to explore sociological theories, right, Annika? We're going to explore these theories that look at generally focus on macro level factors. That is, they want broad explanations for a general category of crime, right? The biological theories, right? These often offer us genetic and or physical characteristics, and I'm going to explain all of these in turn as we move through the lecture. We have psychological theories, near and dear to our hearts, right? And a lot of psychological differences tend to then look at individual differences and or personality types. And then finally, we're going to close out with social psychological theories. And social psychological theories generally look at environmental forces, but then incorporate personality differences in an interactionist point of view. Of the 4 types of theories, we'll find that social psychological theories are generally the most complex, and for most people, because they're the most complex, are the least satisfying. Let's begin with sociological theories, and there's a homework assignment tied to this, so we'll get to that at the end of the lecture, right? And this then should set you up to be able to successfully move through your homework assignment. Sociological theories, what do we know? Well, they de-emphasize individual differences. So they want to talk about large forces. They don't want to talk about individual differences. They don't want to talk about, you know, one-ups. They want to present us with a grand theory. And this really derives from sociological theory that believes that people have the same needs and desires. People are people, and they generally operate in a very consistent manner between people. Okay? And this is quite often true. So part of the assignments at the end of the course is, what does a sociological explanation offer us, and under which context might we most likely rely upon it, right? So sociologists are very interested in social class, socioeconomic status, and opportunity as the most important factors, right? And differences in these opportunities determine the way people fulfill needs and desires. So if I come from a white middle class family, which I did, right? The world was kind of my oyster in the United States. The expectation is I was going to go to college. There's already a place in college for me. I have a family that can afford to send me to college, right? I've got the world by a tail, man. I'm all set up. So when it comes to making money, isn't it logical that I would pursue college and then come out and get myself a dandy middle-class job, do my 2.2 children, and live in the suburbs, right? Because the way the country is constructed facilitates my doing that to a greater extent than someone who grew up in, let's say, a disadvantaged family with no money and a lack of access to better educational opportunities, right? So socioeconomic factors loom heavily in this regard. Now, there's two main types of sociological theory, and I'm going to talk about each separately. There's the subcultural and there's the structural. So let's begin then with the subcultural, and this is that groups themselves hold different values from the dominant culture and thus define success differently. So if we ask the question of people in the United States, what does it mean to be successful? What this is saying is that different groups will in fact respond to that question differently, right? So for me, I was programmed to believe that wife, children, house, good job, decent retirement, X number of vacation weeks a year, this represents the good life, right? For other folks, their interpretation of what represents the good life might be entirely different, based on often ethnicity, that is cultural underpinnings, or SES. So it's similar to social psychological research on self-esteem and disidentification with domains that result in a loss of self-esteem. So for many of us, went to decent schools, you know, and school performance, the school's a good place, it's well kept, etc. Let's think about the graduation rate at Upper Arlington High Schools. What's the graduation rate at Upper Arlington High? It's like frickin' 99.5%. You know, there's that one kid that didn't graduate last year. Think about, now let's come to the Hilltop, and the Hilltop, where I live on the west side of Columbus here, the police call this neighborhood Upper Appalachia. I'm sorry, Urban Appalachia. And so that's not a complimentary term. And if you go to the high school that serves us, west, just a couple blocks away from my house, the graduation rate runs about 69-70%. That's a substantial decrease, right? But let's go to a really economically challenged area. Let's go to Detroit, which has faced severe economic hardship and diminished property values, which diminish the property taxes, which pay for the school. What's the graduation rate from Detroit City Schools? Is 25%, which means that 3/4 of the kids who go into Detroit City High School don't come out with a diploma, right? But think about it. They go to a shitty school that's fallen apart. It's not heated in the winter or barely heated, right? They got books that don't even have covers on them because there's no money to be spent. They hire the worst teachers because none good teachers want to teach at those schools. I mean, there's exceptions. I'm talking kind of globally here. But to them, school is not cool. I mean, school just points out that what they don't know, and it doesn't matter, and it's not a ticket anywhere because they see people in their neighborhood who don't get anything out of school, so they don't value school. People at Upper Arlington High School, they value school to a great extent. So their expectations. To identify with school makes sense in Upper Arlington. To identify with school in Detroit is kind of like a loser's gambit, right? I mean, it doesn't make the same level of sense. So people in Detroit often disidentify with the role of student, and they adopt some other role that will enhance their self-esteem, right? And gang affiliation might be one of those. So, now notice that sociological subcultural explanations can have a value expressive. That is, if school ain't doing it, and school isn't the road to the good life, what is the road to a better life in my neighborhood? And that might be gang membership. And the gangs are recruiting. They're saying, hey, that school shit ain't going to get you anywhere. Come to us, and we can provide you immediate benefits. Here's money right now, right? And here's status, because you can deal drugs in this neighborhood, and that's going to gain you success. And the more drugs you deal and the more successful you do that, the more money you make. So you get to experience an increase in self-esteem as the result of those processes that are more likely to be afforded to you. So we look at these subcultural explanations as valuing things differently. And we often look at gangs, and again, we say, oh, those gang members are stupid, violent, etc. But when you think about it, in interviewing gang members, you know, what they say is, well, what's with all these gang signs? And it says, well, it's to conceal our communications from rival gangs, but also to conceal our communication from police. And then you ask a simple question, but don't people just, you know, learn your gang signs and then the jig's up? And they say, yeah. So sometimes we just redo our signs, our language on a weekly basis. I want you to think about that. When's the last time you redid your language on a weekly basis? This is not a question of intelligence. This is a question of opportunities that are afforded differentially to different subcultures within the United States. And I'm not attempting to excuse anyone. That's not what this is about. What I'm attempting to do is offer potential explanations for observed behavior and offer potential explanations for observed differences. Now, let's talk about structural explanations, still with the sociological. Crime is a response to societal frustration in attainment of universally sought goals. And if that goal is, I want to live the good life, or I want to live comfortably, and your color, your ethnicity, right, or your gender affords you certain opportunities, or not, then crime might become an appealing alternative because it's a way to get what you believe you should have, right? So the rational crime theory then is it might then just be a rational strategy to commit crime. It might make sense economically. So maybe in my environment there's an easy opportunity to shoplift. And the easier it is to shoplift and the less threat there is of consequences for shoplifting, then that's a structural element that facilitates increased levels of shoplifting. Or maybe embezzlement. Right, and we see in Washington now, we've seen some just tremendous, this dark money and this Citizens United that allows corporations to make donations, etc., to candidacies, then increases the view of participating in Washington as a way to make big bucks. Right? And we see it. It's strange when you think, oh, look at this senator who's going to be paid, what, $140,000, $150,000 a year, and since the time they've been in the Senate over the last 20 years, suddenly they have $35, $40 million worth? How do you get there from making $150,000 a year? And you say, they got the shit figured out. They got a way to make the money, and they have this club that they participate in that advantages them, right? It may be legitimate businesses that require certain crimes as part of their business. It might be the preferred livelihood. I mean, there's a guy that lives diagonally across over here, sells dope, sells pot, exclusively. And what does he do? He sells pot. He stays home all day, and he sells pot. And think about it. You know, would you like a job where you just sit on your couch, play video games, or watch movies, and people come to you? You don't even have to go out. People come to you and they say, I want to buy your product, and here's money for me to buy it for what you He just likes it. Think about it. The next time you're dragging your sorry ass to work, as a server or something, and you're going to be on your shelf all night long, and your feet are going to be so sore that you can't stand it at the end of the day, or you're washing dishes and your skin is literally falling off your hands because it's so dried out. Other people are saying, no, that's not for me. I'm going to do this other stuff. Right? So preferred livelihood. And then organized crime, right? And to the extent that we facilitate organized crime, right, is a structural explanation. So, in review, when we look at sociological theories, they're going to provide kind of broad, overarching explanations for a relatively wide array of phenomenon. And, it's not that one set of theories is more accurate than another. The trick for us is to know which theory probably gives us the best explanatory power for this given situation we're trying to explain. So, let's shift to biological theories. We got a bunch of differences, a bunch of different biological theories to look at. One, some of the early theories back in the 1800s, anatomical differences. Okay, so phrenology. Any of you budding phrenologists? This is the bumps on your head, right? And phrenology is a crazy science. This is the actual Fowler's bust, one of the fathers of phrenology. I got to see this. There's a tremendous museum of psychology in Ghent, Belgium. And I got to do a travel abroad for Ohio State. Psychology and Culture was the title. And we went to Cologne, Germany, Ghent, Belgium, and London, England. So over a 2-week period, we went to these places investigating Psychology and Culture. It was a great opportunity, and we got to go to this amazing, frickin' huge museum in Ghent, Belgium, and we got to see the phrenology skull. The simple story is different parts of the brain control different activities. So, what if there was a part of the brain that engaged in criminal activity and criminal reasoning? The idea, if you couple that with the idea of weightlifting, for example, the more you lift a weight, the more it builds up that muscle. Well, the more you use a part of your brain, the more it expands that part of the brain. And the idea was that it can cause an actual physical bump in the skull because the brain is larger in that area. So you sit there and you look at the brain map, right? And then you can say, oh, look at, man, the criminal behavior. There's a bump there, so this must be a criminal. No, phrenology never didn't catch hold for very long. Now, another ancient theory that doesn't hold much is somatotypes. And this was the idea that different body types are indicators of overall behavioral kind of behavioral tendencies. So endomorphs, kind of obese and soft like me, kind of like the Pillsbury Doughboy, you know, right? And then the mesomorph is the athletic, strong type, and this is the predominant criminal type. And the ectomorph is tall and has the well-developed brain. And then they say, well, here's the figure, so you can compare and you can kind of figure out who's who. And it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I mean, you're going, yeah, seriously. But I will offer you this. Let's come to the rescue to this theory a little bit. Who is going to be the most successful in committing a physical assault? And you look at those and you say, okay, well, you know, the mesomorph's athletic and strong, right? So the mesomorph is likely to be the most effective in bullying in aggressive type crime. And if we kind of borrow from the behaviorist, let's say that as children, we've got these three types of children, and they attempt to bully someone or strong-arm someone. There's one that's likely to be successful, and remember, if you're successful and you experience a reward, you're more likely to engage in that behavior in the future. Whereas if you're unsuccessful, if you're punished, then you're less likely to engage in that behavior in the future. So you can see that if you want to be a bully, being an endomorph is not the royal road to bullying, right? You're better off being a mesomorph. But again, this is a useless, weak explanation, really. And these are explanations that were abandoned. Now, other biological theories? Well, we can conduct adoption studies. And what we find is it appears that there does seem to be some genetic material that can be passed on that might increase the probability of criminal behavior. Right? And adoption studies can be very valuable in this regard because we can look at adopted child's characteristics and compare them to both the biological parents, if they're accessible, and the adoptive parents. And I've always been interested in this because I was adopted. So, and you know, in my 30s, I found my birth mother, and I found that I had a half brother. She had a son by a different father. He was 5 years older than I, and he was a criminal all his life. He was in and out of prison. He was a heroin addict. He was a horrible asshole. I found this out later. He's now dead. He died in a nursing home, of all things, because he just destroyed himself, right? How come I didn't turn out to be a criminal? Well, notice that we had two different situations. We had two different upbringings. So the adoptive family, the biological family becomes interesting. In case you're adopted and you want to investigate adoption rights, you can go to Bastard Nation. Yeah, that's what it's called, bastardnation.org, and check it out. Actually, this is an organization that we started in the 1990s out of Southern California. It grew out of a news group, which was a discussion channel for adoptees called Alt Adoption way back in the day when computers and the internet were kind of pretty fresh news. So there is a genetic relationship to criminal behavior through these adoption studies, at least for this sample. And this is where I want to be careful, because what we're going to do is talk about this sample and this study, right? Note that we might find differences in different studies. Now, what we're going to do is look at the potential possibilities. Do the bio parents have any kind of criminal history or background? Yes or no? Simple question. And then we can look at the adoptive parents, and do they have any kind of criminal record? Yes or no? And if you say, oh, well, you know, how can criminals adopt children in the first... Well, there's a lot of interfamily adoptions, etc., so let's not get bogged down in that. But let me ask you this. What do you think the likelihood of a child developing a criminal record of their own, which combination do you think makes it most likely that the child will develop a criminal record? Which combination of the 4 cells available here would be least likely to yield a criminal record? And we look at it, and of course, you know, I miss doing this in class because I would ask you this question and then you guys would all answer, etc. And so I get to answer my own questions, which is almost bordering on mental illness. not really. All right, so let's look. Well, I'm going to bet that if the bio parents had no criminal history and the adoptive parents had no criminal history, then that's the lowest likelihood for the offspring to demonstrate a criminal history. So let's start there, and we see in this sample 13.5% of these children went on to develop their own criminal history. Okay, so we got the lower bound, right, theoretically. What do you think would represent the upper bound? And you probably go, well, that's pretty simple. That would be yes, yes. So let's compare the two. And now notice this is where statistics comes into play. Based on sample size and all this other good stuff, does this statistically differ from this? And in fact it does. So what we see is those in the yes, yes condition, 24.5, almost a quarter of them went on to develop their own criminal record. And that's a substantial difference. That's a difference of 10 percentage points, as you can see. Or you might argue it's almost double. It's about an 80% increase if you want to play that kind of numerical game. Now, let's take them, because we haven't answered the question. We said, is there a biological contribution? We have not answered that question yet. We have to look at the 2 other cells. So let's go ahead and look at biocriminal parent, no, and adoptive parent, yes, and we see almost 15% there. This is probably not statistically significant in its difference. This probably is. Okay. That then might indicate some kind of genetic, but let's look at the final cell. And here where we have bio parents criminal, yes, adoptive parents no, 20%. Different than this, different than this. So based on this graph, what we can look at is say, wow, it does look like there's a genetic contribution to criminal behavior. Now that doesn't mean there's a criminal gene. What it means is there may be some possible inheritable qualities that drive this observed effect. So then we say, well, what might be those possible inheritable qualities? And then once we create this list, then we can design the research to demonstrate that some are more likely as good causal explanations and some are less likely as strong causal explanations. So let's start with this idea of a constitutional predisposition. What does that mean? To what extent is someone robust, and to what extent is someone able to weather cold weather? You know, constitutional predisposition was your general overall capacity to adapt, to be healthy, to not be weak and frail. So there's those people who are strong and robust. There's other people who are weak and frail. That really is kind of the poles of constitutional predisposition. And if you look at, you know, kind of old school English language, I'm going to take my evening constitutional. What that actually meant is, after dinner, I'm going to go out and take a walk around the neighborhood, and that would be to increase one's robustness, one's physical health. So constitutional predisposition. Those, the strong, right, are more likely then to demonstrate strong, maybe criminal tendencies, but you say, oh, I don't know if I want to go there, and it's probably a pretty weak explanation. Maybe in certain circumstances it works. What about neuropsychological abnormalities? And who do we have here? Does anyone know who this is? And does anyone know where we are? Let's start with where we are. We're at the University of Texas, Austin, and that is the library tower at the University of Texas, Austin. And then who is this? You got it now? Well, this is Charles Whitman. Right? And what do we know about Charles Whitman? Let's delve into his past. Let's check it out and see what's going on. We're going to perform what might be called a psychological autopsy. Okay. Well, we know he was an altar boy. Okay. We know he was an honor student all through school. We know he had an IQ of 138, which is hella smart. right? So he's well into the gifted range. He's 138 he's contained within the top 2% of IQ in the population, right? Plenty smart. Hey, he's dedicated. He was a Marine, right? But on the downside, he did kill 16 people. And one morning, he got up. He had killed his mother, with whom he was living. He's going to school on the GI Bill, living with his mom. He kills 16 people. He went to school with a duffel bag full of rifles, went up into that tower, all the way up to the top. He barricaded the door, and then he proceeded to shoot people all around, all 4 directions around the tower. Now, this guy's a Marine, and Marines are trained to be riflemen. That's a long-standing tradition, right? And it really goes back to kind of the core of the United States. At one point in time, we described ourselves as a nation of riflemen. And that is, we hunted with our rifles, and we were accurate with our rifles, and this is how we derive part of our strength within the United States. Any other countries that were thought to be nations of riflemen? Well, if you look at Switzerland, right? You're a member of the service in Switzerland, and you are issued a rifle which you keep at home. I mean, that was historically the way it happened. The same thing was true of Sweden. And notice, these are both countries that were neutral during World War II and maintained their neutrality. The Nazis went into Norway, but they didn't go into Sweden. You got a nation of riflemen there, and you just don't want to mess with these sons of bitches, because it's just too problematic to have to deal with them. Now, the Swiss, of course, maintained their neutrality, as did the Swedes, because they also have resources, money, etc. But part of it was this fear that these people, every able-bodied man is a rifleman, and who wants to, take that shit on, right? So he goes up to the top, he's shooting these people, and how is he shooting people? I mean, this guy's a Marine. He's shooting people at 500-600 yards away. And I want you to consider going up to the top of the library, right, at Ohio State, the main library, and shooting people on High Street. This is essentially what we're saying as far as distance and skill. Anyway, eventually, a police officer, an off-duty police officer, and a security guard bumped into each other, and they made the long, scary dash to the building. They got in the building, they got upstairs, they got through the door, and then they took out Whitman. During the actual physical autopsy, what do we find? Well, we found that he had a tumor about the size of an orange pressing on his amygdala that's thought to be the seat of aggression. He had been suffering depression on and off. He complained about severe headaches. So really we have a neurophysiological abnormality that might be the best explanation for his behavior. Because there's certainly nothing in his behavior to indicate that he would do this. Okay? No. The autonomic nervous system differences, what do we know? We see in psychopaths that they have exceedingly low autonomic nervous system arousal levels. So sometimes criminals' behaviors explained in people with this low ANS is they don't really feel like much is going on, so they kind of need the excitement. They need to generate an element of risk to increase their level of excitement. The physiological differences we've discussed, right? And then the personality and temperament differences. So narcissistic personality disorder, but might be a biological legacy. It might be genetically determined, but let's save the explanations, the outcome of that, to the psychological explanations. Let's close this section, though. What do we do with the genetic explanations? So let's suppose we have sophisticated genome mapping and we find these sources of criminal behavior. Do we then ignore environmental explanations? Do we subject these people to drug therapy? Do we perform surgery? And that is maybe eliminate pieces of the brain, like doing lobotomies, which was one solution that was employed in the past. Do we return to eugenics? And that is when we find bad gene holders, do we then sterilize them so they can't pass those genes on? Or even worse, right, do we in fact just euthanize, that is kill bad gene holders as the Nazis thought about? So what is the promise of gene mapping and restructuring, and what do we do with this knowledge once we have it? And that is a dilemma in and of itself, right? And I'll leave you to consider the horrendous implications of where this conversation could go. Genetic explanations, super scary in that they are. And I know in class you guys would probably be raising your hands now and saying, isn't that like this movie or that movie I've seen? And there's been a lot of discussion about these. If I had it to do over again, would I become a social psychologist? And I don't know. I mean, I love social psychology, but behavioral genetics, I think, would be a fascinating area as well. Beginning to understand the genome, look at the genome as a causal mechanism for observed behaviors is a very enticing field of study, right? But let's go on to psychological theories. And now, how many of you want to be clinical psychologists, counseling psychologists, right? And maybe perhaps work with criminal offenders. This is kind of your red meat then, is to look at the psychological theories. And there's a vast array of psychological theories. We're only going to hit on a few. Now, psychoanalytic theories are really derivatives of Sigmund Freud and are based in psychodynamic processes, that is, internal conflict. Criminal thinking patterns is probably going to be a very unsatisfying explanation when we get there. And then one of my favorites, areas of study and interest is psychopathy. More on that when we get there. Antisocial personality disorder is described in the Diagnostic Statistic Manual of Psychological Disorders, the DSM. And then sociopathy, which is not well defined, but I want to make a case that it should be. So, psychoanalytic theory, what do we know? Sigmund Freud, as the beginner, the prime mover of this type of theory, compulsive need for punishment to alleviate guilt from an unresolved Oedipal stage. So the Oedipal stage, right, is that point as a young man. I love my mother, and that's not weird. I mean, most young men love their mother. And if you ask a 4 or 5-year-old boy, who do you want to marry? I want to marry mom, right? But at this point in time, then you begin to be confronted with the idea you can't marry mom because mom belongs to dad, right? So you make that shift. You then say, I can't have mom. You identify with dad, because to the greater extent that you identify with dad, then you might be like dad to be able to find someone like mom, right? So that's this shift, and it's the resolution of the Oedipal complex, that is, loving one's mother in that way, which is still not available to a 4 or 5-year-old, but nonetheless. So if I don't resolve my Oedipal complex, then what Freud is saying is it creates this conflict, and I repress this conflict, and it manifests itself in, man, I need to be punished. So I'm going to commit crimes, because eventually if I commit crimes, I will be caught and then I will be punished. This is a convoluted explanation, and it's not a very good one. So thank you, Dr. Freud. I love Dr. Freud, but I don't think when we come to explain criminal behavior, Freud is the go-to. Now, Franz is more of a neo-Freudian, which means new after Freud, or takes Freudian theory, psychodynamic theory, and advances it in a certain context. It's the reality principle, which Freud named, right? Unable to delay gratification due to family or social forces. So in this case, I just haven't been taught that, no, you can't have it. Most of us learn that there's certain things we want that we can't have, and we just have to learn to deal with it. Or we can't have things now, but if we work hard, over time we can gain gratification through hard work and patience, right? Think about the marshmallow test by Walter Mischel. That is, you offer someone, you say, hey, little kid, do you want this marshmallow? You can have this marshmallow now, or if you wait 10 minutes, you can have 2 marshmallows, right? And what Mischel showed is children who could delay the gratification had more satisfactory life outcomes 40 years from now. Now, is this also a biologically based, is this a genetically based phenomenon? So notice that we can take the psychological principles and often look for genetic causal mechanisms for the observed psychological state. So these theories aren't necessarily exclusive to each other. They might interact in certain respects. And the more we know, the more we'll learn to appreciate the nature of those potential interactions. Now, Bowlby who is the attachment guy, right, said insufficient or frustrated attachment leads to substitute forms gratification. So if, and now we get into this area where if you have this cold mother, this cold unemotional mother, then it could in fact cause you to seek gratification since you're not getting it from mom, from other sources. And that might be hanging out with the wrong people or committing crime or what have you. Again, maybe in some cases, but how many really? Fromm, and I'm reading Eric Fromm's Escape from Freedom, is a fascinating work. Freedom makes many people insecure, so they move to assert control through societal mechanisms. And that is, people actually fear their own freedom. It's a fascinating work, and it's a pretty complex theory. But the idea is that way back in the Middle Ages, you knew your place. And your place was spelled out for you, right? So this is what you're going to do, you know, in 1200. This is what you're going to do in 1300. This is your life, and you learn to accept it, right? Once we began to enter into medieval times and Calvinism and Protestantism started to take hold, then we entertained this notion that you can do anything you want, you know, if you work hard enough. But people didn't know what to do, so they become scared and they seek out people to tell them what to do. They then embrace authoritarians. And of course, nothing like that could happen in this day and age, could it? Could you have literally millions of people in this country bow down to an authoritarian figure? Or yeah? I don't know. So, regardless, right? Psychoanalytic theory is probably not the best area to go for criminal explanations, although it might work in certain situations. And note that psychological theories can be applied individually. Why is this person offender, right? Whereas a sociological theory is seeking to make broad explanations about classes or groups of people. Now, let's think about personality. And what we see in personality is one of the most deadly personality constructs is narcissism. And I can't think now, coming out of 2021, anyone who doubts the potential disaster effects of someone in a leadership position with narcissistic personality disorder needs to kind of revisit what's happened over the last 4 years. People who have a high level of narcissism, they put themselves first of everyone else, right? So people with narcissism, although, and it's an interesting conundrum, because if I were to run for president, doesn't that mean, if I'm running for the office of president, doesn't it kind of indicate that I believe that I'm special enough to be the president? And that's going to require a certain level of narcissism. And we'll find that many presidents do demonstrate a somewhat elevated level of narcissism. But when the narcissism becomes pathological, it becomes dangerous. I won't listen to others because I know better than anyone else. If someone attacks me, if someone says something bad about me, then I must respond. And vengeance becomes one of my primary motives, is to right these wrongs against me, right? And to never admit mistakes. Okay. Those are all, so, and I'm justified in harming other people if it suits my needs or my purposes. So narcissism, and we see many people, famous people throughout history, or infamous people, who had pathological levels of narcissism. And some are just staggering pathological levels of narcissism. Now, histrionic personality, and this personality disorder is where we see people who, in fact, like big displays, right? And it's like life is often a performance art, and they overact it, and we can see where that might be. One thing I observe here in the Hilltop, which is strange, during the summer, it hasn't happened for a couple summers, thank God, but as we get people who want to fight each other, and it might be this house against that house, and I've watched it because it starts from the porches, and they're screaming and shit at each other from the porches, and then they move out to the sidewalk, and then finally the ultimate is this histrionic display of aggression towards each other in the middle of the street so that they block traffic and gather the attention of a crowd. And it's funny because you can actually watch these assholes looking around to monitor the crowd, and they get jacked up, and this is kind of a histrionic, over-the-top display, right? Now, borderline personality disorder is a devastating disorder where people, unlike narcissism, who have this uber inflated kind of self-esteem, people with borderline personality disorder often suffer from a lack of self-esteem or a variable level of self-esteem. So they look for their self-esteem to be bolstered, and it puts often a lot of pressure on the people that they're in a relationship with to constantly feed them positive aspects, and if those aspects, don't happen, or if you attempt to criticize, they can respond violently because it has such an impact. But notice the same is true for narcissism. To say bad things about a narcissist often enrages them, and they feel the need to retaliate. Okay. Narcissism is bad news, right? So this is kind of an unfulfilling explanation, but it might hold some truth. That criminal thinking patterns, there's a lot to this, that people who engage in criminal behavior just think differently about the world. And that's okay, but now it becomes kind of tautological, right? Because, oh look, this person has a criminal thinking pattern, so they behave like a criminal, and because they're a criminal, they have a criminal thinking pattern. I don't know that we've explained anything using that terminology, but it's there for our consideration. Now, what's coming up? What do you think? Let's talk about psychopaths. And when we talk about psychopaths, we're going to talk about Robert Hare and his collaborator, his chief collaborator Wong. They're at the University of they're up at British Columbia, right, in Canada. And is the psychopath the equivalent of pure evil? Let's take this. This is Hare's quote, that among the most devastating features, psychopathy are a callous disregard for the rights of others and a propensity for predatory and violent behaviors. Without remorse, psychopaths charm and exploit others for their own gain. They lack empathy and a sense of responsibility. They manipulate, they lie and con others with no regard for anyone's feelings. And psychopaths, can be observed to lie for the sake of lying, and they lie about everything. And they have no conscience regarding this. Back in the day, if we go back 100 years before the term psychopathy was invented, it was invented in the 40s by a guy named Hervey Cleckley, who wrote the book The Mask of Sanity. And if you're interested, Cleckley's book is out of copyright, so you can Google Mask of Sanity and get a PDF of the book for free, right? At least, interesting book to say the very least, right? And then Hare went on and refined the concept and developed the measures of the concept. But no, absolutely remorseless and lie with impunity. Just don't care. Now the psychopathy features then, and let's take a look at this, is Hare has constructed a system of assessing psychopathy, and it requires an interview and it requires a record search. So it's not a paper and pencil test. You don't hand it to someone to determine whether there's a psychopath. You need a trained clinician, a trained licensed clinician, to administer the interview and then do the record, do the archival research. And from that, then you score these topics, the prevalence in the client. 0 means not present, 1 means present some of the time, and then you score it as a 2 if it's present a great deal of the time. So does the person demonstrate glibness or superficial charm? And most psychopaths can charm the pants right off of you. Psychopaths tend to be popular, right? And one of the big problems for job interviews, when we take personnel psychology and we talk about, if you take personnel psychology and we talk about interviews, hey Annika, oh no, Annika, what are you doing, Quincy? Big boy. So what do we see? We see that who's most likely to excel in an interview, an employment interview, is a psychopath. This is why interviews should be not used for personnel selection. I know, I kind of swim upstream trying to promote that idea, but I floated that idea in a meeting of psychologists the other day, and they would not go there because they want to trust their ability to see through people because they're psychologists, and the interview is the best tool they have. And it's like, no, it's been demonstrated empirically to be no better than tossing a coin, right? Interviews yield chance. But so psychopaths tend to be very charming and very glib, right? Psychopaths can be manipulative, highly manipulative, and this also means not only are they manipulative, but they think it's okay to be manipulative, right? They're callous, they lack empathy. They can't feel another's pain, right? They demonstrate no remorse or no guilt. And I want you to consider what your life would be like if you had no guilt-evoking mechanism, if you are not amenable to cognitive dissonance, if you will. Right? They have shallow affect, and that is their emotional activation or the substrate, their affective stream is generally suppressed. Right? So they don't have any kind of intensity of feeling that many of us do. They have a grandiose sense of self-worth, and this is one of the ways to describe narcissism. It's a component of narcissism, so they tend to be extremely narcissistic. Right? Now, these are considered primary characteristics according to Hare, and there's actually 10 and 10. There's actually 20 items. I'm going to give you about 16 just to abbreviate the list slightly. But these are primary, and what I mean by primary is these can be considered to have perhaps a genetic basis. Right? Now, the primary characteristics then lead to secondary characteristics, but secondary characteristics are thought to be more behavioral. So think in terms of primary as personality-based and maybe have a genetic basis, where secondary are more environmental and an outgrowth of the personality characteristics. So a person who's high in primary characteristics then might go ahead and demonstrate impulsivity. They might then demonstrate higher levels of irresponsibility. So they might be quoted saying something like, I take no responsibility at all. Right? If they're confronted with their responsibility, they will continually fail to accept their responsibility. They demonstrate promiscuous sexual behavior. Right? So they may have a huge number of affairs outside of wedlock. They engage in pathological lying. They lie all the time about virtually anything. And if they're confronted with their lies, then they ignore it or explain them away. And they might have a history of problems, conduct disorder, or juvenile delinquency. Right? So you see that how one list can lead to the other. Well, I'm going to get to talking about the differences between this list in another way here in just a minute. So let's take a look. The behaviors, the secondary characteristic, these observable behaviors, and then the character traits, let's call it the primary qualities, and there's a fuzzy boundary between the two, right? There's 20 in all, and as you interview the client and then you go through their records, you score each anywhere from 0 to 20, as I previously described. A score of 40 is then possible. So a person given the psychopathy checklist designed by Hare, right, then and administered by a clinician, can yield a score anywhere from 0 to 40. And Hare has established a cutoff point that greater than 30 is a psychopath. And this represents what's called the taxonometric approach. What we're saying is, hey, boom, 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 not psychopath, hit the threshold, now psychopath. So what this does is it splits the world into psychopaths and non-psychopaths. Right? Now, what do we know? In the prison population, 23.4 is kind of the average score. Psychiatric institutions, the average score in this measure is 20.6. The base rate in the general population is thought to be maybe 1%. So if we were sitting in the classroom now, I would torture you guys with this notion. There's 160 of us sitting in this room. 1.6 of us are psychopaths. Although that might not be the case given the environment, or it might not be. And here's the weird thing. If we made a comparison between a class in Pomeran of psychology students versus a class of Fisher of business students, which group is likely to generate more psychopaths? Yeah, never mind. So, what do we know? Base rate in prison, it might be 40 to 50% might qualify as psychopaths within a prison environment rather than a college environment. Now, here's the deal. I'm a social psychologist. Clinical psychologists like the taxonometric. They like to score an instrument and say, yes, you're a psychopath, or no, you're not. As a social psychologist, my statistical approach, my training has been that things operate on a continuum. So if you have 0 to 40, with 40 being maximum of psychopathy, 0 absent, you go down this list, okay, 15 is less than 20, and 20, is more than 13, that I kind of then envision psychopathy as not yes or no, but how much psychopathy. And let me give you an example. If 30 is the cutoff, but let's say your daughter brings home who she wants to be her new husband, her fiance, who's going to be her new husband. What if he scores a 28? That's close enough for me, right? You got to reconsider this young lady. Maybe we'll look for someone else. Right, Quincy? What are you doing? Are you getting hungry, buddy? It's too early to eat, isn't it? Yeah, we got like an hour and 10 minutes to feeding time. They get busy when they sense, about an hour before feeding time, so. Quincy was the most sickly little thing when we found him out on the porch. He was next to death, and I remember I took him to Dr. Queller, and Dr. Queller looked at me and said, "You found another one of these, huh?" And he just looks at me and says, "I don't know. We'll do our best." And look at this robust guy now. He really kind of did well. He's 16 and a half pounds. This is a big cat. Why are you biting? All right. Now, I had the distinct honor when I was at University of California, Irvine, and I was at the School of Social Ecology, and it's an interesting school. Psych and social behavior was one of the programs, but criminal justice was another program within that school, environmental analysis and design, child development. So it's kind of a very holistic West Coast kind of approach, the School of Social Ecology. I got to take 3 classes with Dr. Navako, who's a leading forensic psychologist, right? And also a very capable, why are we eating the TV? A very capable social psychologist. He had a foot in both qualities. And I took forensic psychology with him. It was a great seminar. I took 3 classes with Navako. One was field research methods, that was a big class. And then I took violence in society, which was one of his flagship classes. And then he taught this little undergraduate seminar, forensic psychology, and he limited the enrollment to 15. What a pitching class. And so we had to write an extended paper. That was most of what the course grade was based on, was picking a research project and writing a paper. And the paper that I chose to write was, hey, Dr. Navako, what do you think? And because he's an expert on this and he's interviewed and treated psychopaths his whole existence, I said, we see the primary and we see the secondary characteristics. And I said, but what does intelligence have to do with this? And my question to him was, if someone demonstrates high intelligence, right, and they're high in the primary characteristics, could they escape being observed committing the behaviors that are implied in the secondary characteristics? And he said, why don't you explore that? So, what that meant is I got to go read everything I can about psychopathy, a zillion research articles, and then craft it into a paper. And from that, I developed this model. And I will say something about Dr. Navako. I turned in this paper, and when I got this paper back from him, his handwritten notes on the paper, because we turned in physical paper and he handed it back, I don't know that I've ever had a paper that had as many comments on it. Right? And I mean, he obviously just enjoys reading these papers and writes all these comments. And basically, here is the relationship I proposed. Right? And it's unsupported by any research because it's not my research area, really. That is, people who are high in psychopathy factor 1, so all those kind of maybe genetically personality-based characteristics, and they happen to be high in Machiavellianism, successful manipulation of others. They happen to be high in intelligence, and they happen to be high in their ability to successfully manage their impression. To the extent they're high in all these qualities, then what we're going to see is a reduced number or a reduced score in the factor 2 psychopathy, the observable behaviors. Right? Now, to the extent that they're of low intelligence, and low in impression management and low in Machiavellianism, then we should see higher observed behavioral characteristics, right? So basically what we're looking at, and this gets back to what Hare was saying, that if he couldn't study psychopaths in prison, he would study them on Wall Street. And basically what we're talking about here is people who are blessed with higher levels of intelligence can figure out how to do their psychopathic shit at a lower rate of detection, so less behaviors are pinned on them, so to speak. And ultimately then, intelligent psychopaths generate high successful life outcomes and then less likely to generate the low successful outcomes. Okay. So that was my new contribution to this idea. So let's then move away from this moderating, and these are what are called moderating variables. What moderates the expression of factor 2 psychopathy? I'm proposing that it's these variables. And interestingly, there's been some research on intelligence as being a significant moderator in the demonstration of factor 2 psychopathy by others who did the really hard work rather than just simply writing an undergraduate paper. Let's keep it in context, huh? So, unique problems of the psychopath. Well, they may have deficits in the behavioral inhibition system. So when some of us are approaching something that might turn out poorly, that might have a negative consequence, we have this non-conscious mechanism called the behavioral inhibition system that says stop. And it works on a physical level. If like, suppose you're cooking on the oven, on the stove with a cast iron pan, and you know when you heat the cast iron pan, the handle gets hot too. And what if you're about to grab that pan without a hot mitt and you go, right before you put your hand on that handle and burn yourself, something out of nowhere says stop, and you look and say, oh shit, I almost burned myself. That's the behavioral inhibition system. So to what extent, as we're approaching a negative outcome, might the behavioral inhibition system stop us from doing it? Maybe it doesn't function as well in the psychopath. And if you're interested in that, I do a whole lecture on emotion and psychopathy, and we explore these ideas in Psych of Emotion. So, now, increased sensation seeking. We talked about lower autonomic nervous system arousal. So maybe psychopaths, and they've been demonstrated through many studies to have this lower arousal system, maybe they need to do exciting, thrilling, risky things to raise their sensation seeking, their arousal level to what we would consider a normal level, right? Some people suggest that psychopaths just don't have a fear mechanism. And that one's controversial. They demonstrate fearlessness, that they just aren't afraid of the consequences of their action. And what are the potential facilitating phenomenon? Let's suppose that psychopathy is a genetic predisposition. But does it take something to kick it into gear, some kind of environmental factor that causes psychopathy to engage, right? And we can look at social learning theory by Albert Bandura as perhaps a way of, if I'm in a society where psychopaths seem to be excelling, they seem to be gaining the rewards, right? If I'm in a society that doesn't provide any penalties for bad behavior, then it might then facilitate psychopathic responding in people who have that tendency to begin with. Maybe it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. That is, these people are different, they have a genetic basis, and they're pointed out to be troublemakers, let's say in school. And once labeled a troublemaker, then maybe they begin to act like a troublemaker, right? So the self-fulfilling prophecy, the Pygmalion effect, however you learned about that. And maybe it's self-serving attributional explanations. When they then try to explain the cause of their behavior, right, they tend to do it in a way that serves the self and protects the self-esteem. Right? It could also be disidentification. That is, and we talked about this earlier in the sociological theories, is maybe the path to what I want is blocked by my group membership or whatever, so I disidentify with doing it the right way, and I adopt more psychopathic systems of behavior to achieve my goals or achieve what I want. No. This is really a conundrum, because when we look at the psychopathic brain, we see tremendous differences in how the brain operates. When non-psychopaths process negative emotional words like rape, death, cancer, activity in the limbic regions of the brain increased. For psychopaths, there was observed to be no or little increased activity in these regions. So those things that maybe make us feel negatively about certain situations don't occur in a psychopath, right? Curiously, however, there was increased activity in other areas. In short, these emotion-laden words, negative or positive, don't have the same limbic implication for psychopaths that they do for normal people. And so Harris discussed this. Now, the deal is, though, and when we look at these brain-level phenomenon, one caveat that always applies is what we observe in the brain the result of habit and training, or was it the causal mechanism? So often we don't know what we're observing is either the result or is it the cause, and that's very difficult to tease apart, right, without the use of random assignment. And the problem is we can't randomly assign people into negative conditions, negative life conditions. It would be unethical, right? And also then what we're looking at, are we looking at something that's essentially untreatable? And if it is untreatable, what do we do about it? And remember, psychopathy is never useful as a criminal defense. You can't say, I'm not guilty by reason of insanity because I'm a psychopath. Psychopathy is not considered, right, a mental illness within the structure of the court system. Now, again, looking at it from a biological or genetic point of view, Dr. Marnie Rice views that psychopathic behavior as an evolved survival strategy. So she's suggesting, she says that there's not a lot of evidence to suggest that psychopaths are mentally ill, but there's good reason to believe their disturbing behavior is an evolved trait. She says psychopaths have evolved to capitalize on a particular environmental niche, namely preying on the rest of society. And now imagine this. To the extent that we fail to prosecute and punish psychopaths, which may have no impact at all, but then to prosecute jails so that we incapacitate psychopaths, to the extent we fail to do that, do we just then encourage increased psychopathic behavior? That is, if we have white-collar criminals who are psychopaths and they get minimal punishments if they're punished at all, do we create an environment where the psychopaths are allowed to flourish and the rest of us are put at an evolutionary disadvantage? And I think that's a fascinating argument, yeah? And again, what do we do about it? Now, Hare and Wong look at psychopathy, and they're kind of at the point now, after literally, 3 decades of research and understanding and development of this construct, they say we can't cure psychopaths. At best, we can try to design interventions that limit the damage they do to society. Now, I want you to consider, if Joseph Stalin was a psychopath and was literally capable of killing 7 or 8 million people with absolutely no remorse, what other world leaders have we been faced with that have body counts that are horrendous, right? And seem to care not about it? Well, so psychopathy, in a nutshell or not so much of a nutshell. Let us explore the DSM, which is the gold standard for clinicians in the United States for diagnosing, classifying mental disorder. The one that we're probably most familiar with then is the classification of antisocial personality disorder. Now I'm going to put 3 disorders up. We've got psychopathy we just discussed. Now I'm going to discuss antisocial personality disorder, and then third I'm going to discuss sociopathy. And we can contrast and compare the 3. So that's really the purpose of presenting them in this order. What does it mean to be diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder? You're going to present yourself to a clinician, they're going to talk to you, and then they're going to do a little checklist, right? And they're going to say, hey, does this person have a pervasive pattern of disregard of the rights of others since age 15? And now we look for 3 or more indicators. So we've got this list. Are at least 3 of these present? So are they at least age 18? Is there evidence of conduct disorder onset to prior to age 15? Occurrence of antisocial behavior, and notice that it can't be during schizophrenic or manic episodes, because then there might be a better explanation for the observed behavior according to the DSM. So here's our opportunity, like I suggested, to compare these 3 different constructs: psychopathy, sociopathy, and antisocial personality disorder. Since we have psychopathy under our belt, why don't we go ahead and tackle aspd? And this is a DSM criteria, so it comes to us straight out of the Diagnostic Statistic Manual. And as such, we know that the DSM focuses strictly on observable behaviors and less on clinical judgment. So a behavioral-driven approach increases clinician reliability and diagnosis between clinician diagnosis. So when we look at many of the criteria that come to us from the ASPD, they're very clear cut, and it's really just kind of ticking off the boxes, and if you make enough tick marks, then you're entitled to make the diagnosis indicated. So for antisocial personality disorder, what does this checklist look like? Well, we need to observe pervasive pattern of disregard for the rights of others since age 15, right? And we're on the next slide going to look for 3 indicators, so the explanations will come. We have to be talking about someone who's at least age 18. There has to be evidence of conduct disorder onset prior to age 15. So that is, there's a history of this type of behavioral violations. And then the occurrence of antisocial behavior is not exclusive to periods of schizophrenia or manic episode. And notice that DSM is very careful to disqualify someone for a disorder in the presence of another disorder that maybe carries greater explanatory power. So from that, what are the ASPD indicators, and how many of these were we looking for? Anyone? It was 3, correct? So, failure to conform to social norms, laws by repeatedly performing acts that are grounds for arrest, right? Demonstration of deceitful behavior, conning for profit or pleasure, impulsivity, okay? Reckless disregard for the safety of the self or others, consistent irresponsibility towards work obligations, and lack of remorse, indifference to or rationalizing of behavior towards others. So note that there's a tremendous overlap with psychopathy, but if the construct ASPD can capture this many people within a sample of those, psychopaths will represent this many, right? So one question we can ask is does every psychopath, could they be designated as having ASPD? And the likely answer to that is yes. But far from it in the opposite direction, right? That is, a lot of people will diagnose with ASPD, but are not at the level of full-blown psychopathy. Hey, Penelope, did you come to say hello to everybody? Huh? Yeah, it's a good girl. Give everyone a good look. Okay, so we'll pet you, and then you'll probably go to sleep, huh? So, now let's talk about the strange, what I call the strange middle ground of the sociopath. And the sociopath, I think, is a tremendously important construct that just hasn't taken firm hold in the scientific community yet. And I hope someone really advances the agenda and pushes it forward. And the idea is that the more we learn, the more we see that psychopathy probably has a genetic basis. And it might operate somewhat like schizophrenia. The psychopathy genetically demonstrates a predisposition, and then if you have the right environmental circumstances at the right time, boom, it triggers and then manifests itself into the demonstration of psychopathy. So, you know, and the diathesis stress models explained in schizophrenia is akin to that. That is, you have, perhaps the possibility of becoming a psychopath, but a schizophrenic, and then high-level stressors, especially in adolescence, then activate, the genetic legacy there. So, with sociopath, what we're talking about is these people who are socialized into this behavior. So, think about it though, for understanding treatments, if we have a genetically based disorder like psychopathy, treatment might be more difficult and might be of a different nature than it would be for someone who is socialized into psychopathy, hence we might call it sociopathy. And I think you'll see the diagnostic criteria is much broader for sociopathy than it is for psychopathy. So let's go through here. You're not going to find it in the DSM. You're not going to find it in the official psychiatric nomenclature either. Lycan, who's researched this for 30 or 40 years, distinguishes between the sociopath and the psychopath in that the sociopath is socialized into psychopathy, while the psychopath is born that way, their genetic legacy. All right? Now, Martha Stout wrote a book, 2005, The Sociopath Next Door, and she's probably given us the most complete characterization or starting point for the construct of sociopath. So, this is defined by any 3 according to Stout. So, do we observe in the person egocentricity? Do we observe callousness? Do we observe impulsivity? Do you observe conscience defect? And that's that oldie but goodie I'd been talking about earlier. I just love that term, conscience defect. Exaggerated sexuality, excessive boasting, right? Risk-taking, Inability to resist temptation, that is, they're going to fail Walter Mischel's marshmallow test. Antagonistic, deprecating attitude towards the opposite sex, and lack of interest in bonding with a mate. And as it says, this came from The Sociopath Next Door by Stout. Now, I want you to consider then, basically, if we see someone present with any three of these, then they qualify as a sociopath in Stout's definition. But Stout goes on and she then develops 4 subtypes of sociopathy. The commons, and these are characterized mostly by their lack of conscience. So you see, when we look at any three of those qualities, then there would be a combination, several combinations of 3 that might put people in the common area, right? The alienateds, these are people that are demonstrate an inability to love or to be loved, right? The aggressives, these are people that present with a common sadistic streak, right? So sadism, harming others. And then the disocials, it's an inability to abide by gang rules. I always mess that up. By an ability to abide by gang rules, as long as those rules are the wrong rules, right? And so if we go back to Nazi Germany, I like to pick on Nazi Germany quite a bit, you would see a lot of disocials. It would be easy to diagnose disocials because they follow the rules of the SA or the SS back in the day. They do horrendous things toward people, but they are following rules. It's just rules that result in the harm of others, right? I.e. the wrong rules, if you want to so label them. So I'm a big fan of sociopathy. I'm hoping that some budding psychologists with a forensic bent grab a hold of this, make it their own, flesh it out, and develop an instrument, a system of measuring it, and then that will inspire forensic clinicians to, in fact, develop treatments that are designed for each of the subtypes, right, and address those issues. Now, I want to present something that's new and kind of popular in the last 10, 20 years. People have been talking about the dark triad, and I mean, it's cool, but at the same time, I'm like, what is this bias that we don't already own, having the construct, let's say, of psychopathy, the potential construct of sociopathy, and aspd. So someone who presents and can be diagnosed as part of the dark triad, and it's not used in that manner yet, right? And here's a link if you want to check more. You can check out, there are tests for this. But what is it? It's narcissism, psychopathy, and Machiavellianism. But the deal is, look, these are all contained in psychopathy in the first place. So again, I think they're trying to advance a construct that's broader than psychopathy, but it's confusing. I'm not sure what this is for, other than maybe some people wanted to develop something of their own and publish on their own in this regard. I don't know that it buys us more than what we already have. Now, I could be wrong about that, and people who want to explore this might offer us something else. Now, from the dark triad, and you can look in more detail at your leisure, but from the dark triad, some people are saying there's something missing, there's something significant missing. What do you think was missing? What do you think people are saying? There's something missing in this. Well, we go to the dark tetrad. So we go from tri to tetrad. So we go from 3 to 4 components. The dark tetrad is the dark triad, but an additional construct is added in, and that's called sadism. And suddenly I'm kind of like on board, because I don't think that enough attention is given to sadism as a construct. And this notion, we talk about bullying, and we talk about people who feel vengeful and want to harm others for the sake of harming others, is really the result of sadism. People who take pleasure in watching other people physically, emotionally, or mentally hurt. Right? So these are the sadists among us, and so we add we take the dark triad, and then we plug in sadism, and we've got the dark tetrad, so the triad becomes the dark tetrad, darker still. Is it useful? Again, I'll leave that to the future. My end game's winding down, so I'm hopefully passing the ball to you guys to carry downfield a little further. Right? Now, assessment of sadistic personality. Let's take a look at this instrument, and obviously someone is agree or disagree. I've made fun of people so that they know I'm in control. Oh, that's rather unpleasant, isn't it? I would never get tired of pushing people around. I would hurt somebody if it meant I would be in control. When I mock someone, it's funny to see them get upset. Being mean to others can be exciting. I get pleasure from mocking people in front of their friends. Watching people get into fights excites me. I think about hurting people who irritate me, and that's kind of that vengeance component, right? And I would not purposely hurt anybody. I would not purposely hurt anybody, even if I didn't like them. And notice, this is a reversed item, so in this one, the response should be the opposite if it's an indicator of sadistic personality. This assessment of sadistic personality. So this is available, or where's the link, right? We have the link there. I thought I had the link, yeah. So you can check it out if you're so inclined, right? And this is where we go. Now, people are offering continuously more and more measures and developing more and more constructs. I've been working on one off and on for 10 years. I'm not a researcher, so I don't really have the time, but I've worked with many students, many Buckeyes over the course of time, working on a measure that assesses predatory instinct, and that is the endorsement of predatory behaviors, which is not, psychopaths can demonstrate predatory behavior. People in the dark triad could demonstrate predatory behavior, but I was thinking in terms of developing a pre-screening employment measure, and that is, think of the occupations where you don't want people with predatory tendencies, and this would be part of their assessment as employment applicants, right, to determine their level of potential predation. Child care workers, police officers, these are occupations in which we don't need predators, nurses, etc., and go on down the list. Unfortunately, my life takes me in about 16 different directions at once, and I'm not primarily a researcher, I'm primarily a teacher. So this always gets set aside, it always gets set aside. I don't know that it will ever be completed, but it's been fun to work on, and it's served as a good training tool for a lot of students who've come through the lab and helped work on it. So, this all being said, and all the scientific application of testing people's personality traits or inferring personality traits from their observed behaviors as part of the deal is all well and good. But for some of us, Terrence, you're not going to knock over that camera, are you? He looks dangerously close to knocking over the camera. He's now going to eat the antenna. So, maybe this just exhausted us, all this thinking about these ideas. Maybe crazy is just a better way to go. But remember, crazy is not a psychological term, and crazy ain't a legal term either. So when we go crazy, we're just taking a shortcut, And no, we're not. We're going to look at all sides. Is it religious crazy? Is it simply crazy? Is it right-wing crazy? Is it left-wing crazy? Crazy is crazy, and crazy is probably not the best explanation we can offer for observed behavior. And remember, that's what this lecture is about, is what theories will we use to explain observed behavior. And in your assignments, don't come back at me, please, with crazy as an explanation, because I just don't think it cuts it, right? It might feel good to use it, but I don't think it's sufficient. So let's talk about some social psychological theories, right? And social psychologists are way interactionists. And what does that mean? We emphasize both the person and the environment when they're formed by and operate within. And I'm going to give you an example, a rather extensive example when we get into the punishment section of our own research, where we combine both these ideas. That is, situational manipulations in the laboratory that affected people of different personality constructs differently. So the social psychologist is about the power of the situation, but they also understand that personality characteristics can moderate how situational variables operate to eventually cause behavior. So behavior is what? A combination of the environment and the person. So, really derived from social psychological study of the self, and that's kind of at the core of social psychology, and really was kind of offered up from sociology simultaneously. The self is our concept of who we are, and it's inherently social. Margaret Mead talked about the looking glass self, and that others reflect back to us who we are, and that's how we come to know ourselves through our interactions. Okay, so social psychology is inherently social, and inherently it's hard to escape the self is a construct in most social psychological theory. Now, I'm going to start with some not quite social psychological theory, and the problem with social psychology is it spans this gap, right, between experimental psychology and sociology. So it often, let's face it, social psychologists are greedy, and they try to take as many phenomenon and call them social psychological phenomenon. One of these might then be control theory, and this assumes in people a need to control, right? And it emphasizes the need to control behavior by focusing on one's perception of the expectations of others, reinforcement of conventional behavior, and endorsement of prevailing norms. Now, what does this mean? This means that people in authority, right, who are high in this construct of control feel a great need to control these aspects in other people. But some people then don't necessarily like the sensation of being controlled. So we can see a great deal of tension that's derived from control theories, and we can really look at them from different points of view. Okay. Now, the importance of the self. Let's get into this construct. The self concept contains standards for behavior normatively formed, and that means through our relationship to our school, our parents, our church, our community, our peers, we develop standards for behavior, right? As a result of this interaction, this is something that we do over time. Now, when we think about socio-moral development, there's really two researchers that are cool to look at. And one would be Erik Erikson, who looks at socio-development through the socio-emotional development through the lifespan. And the other is Lawrence Kohlberg, right, who talked about moral development and the 6 levels of moral development. So both have developed scales to pinpoint where someone is at their developmental process. And you'll see that, especially with Kohlberg, many people that we've observed in government over the last 4 years have the socio-emotional development that's akin to what we would expect normally formed in a toddler, and they never develop beyond that. So I think one thing that's important to understand is that age is no guarantee of development. So just because someone's got 60, 65, 75 years under their belt doesn't mean that they function any more morally than or any less selfishly than a toddler would. Right? So consider that. And when we look at people who are engaging in criminal behavior for themselves and not for the greater good, then they've never internalized the idea that much of what we do to be a member of society, not to selfishly, satisfy our own needs. Right, Annika? So, environmental cues, important though, and environmental cues can go a long way in reaffirming normative standards for behavior. Self-awareness is one trigger to this, and one of my favorite studies that demonstrates this was a Halloween study. What the researchers did was they put a big bowl of candy out in front of a doorway during Halloween, and they had a sign on the big bowl of candy, which is like overflowed with candy. It says, "Please take only one piece of candy." Well, what was the manipulation? That's the setup for the experiment. The manipulation was half the time there was a mirror, so as you approach the bowl of candy, then you would see yourself, or, right, the mirror was absent. And what they found is, in the mirror condition, people were more likely to adhere to the notion of one piece of candy. When the mirror was gone, people would often take more than that. Now, obviously, this is on average, as any social psychological study. There was individual differences observed through both experimental conditions, right? But the majority of people, right, in the take only one condition did, in fact, take only one when the mirror was present. Okay, so. Note that when you walk through stores, look at all the mirrors. If you think those mirrors are all there so that you can look at yourself and say, "Oh my, aren't I pretty?" There's a component of that, but it also derives from the study. That is, it makes us aware of ourselves, and when I look at myself, it puts me in touch with who I am, and part of who I am is my morals that have been normatively formed. Now, self-esteem is our evaluation attitude towards who we are, or at least who we appear to be. And note that I'll go back to the sociological explanations. If I'm in a shitty school, right, and participating in school is a constant attack on my self-esteem, but as I walk out of school and engage with a gang, they build up my self-esteem, then it's easy to see how the self drives me away from school and towards the gang. Right? And we really have to think in terms of how are we creating a situation that benefits people, benefits their self-esteem in a genuine manner, right? It becomes inherently attractive to people if we can pull it off. And that means we may have to spend more money on the schools, right? How do you feel if you walk into a shitty building that's falling apart, you can't get hot water, right? The water is dirty in the school water fountain anyway, right? You got shitty books like I described before. What that's saying is we don't really value you. And your participation in this thing that we're calling your school is really demeaning rather than uplifting. And it puts people in a negative, they view their own self-esteem negatively as a result of being kind of captured in that situation. Okay, let's change gears a little bit and talk about differential association approach. This is more psychological, to be sure, and some people might argue more cognitive psychological than social psychological. We learn through interactions, and it's not the only technique is learned, but motives and rationalization as well. And some people call prisons, crime schools. And certainly there could be an element of truth, especially if people are left unsupervised. If leadership is up for grabs in a prison and we leave leadership then to the most powerful inmates, sure, then it becomes a crime school. Not only is the techniques to commit crime being learned, but the reasons that one is entitled to commit crime are being communicated over and over again and being internalized by people in that situation. So how we manage prisons, either as rehabilitative facilities or simply incapacitation factories, has a profound effect on how people respond and what the ultimate outcome of being in prison is. And we really need to kind of take it as a needs. We need to go to the end state. How do we want people to behave when they leave prison? And then we need to work backwards and understand their time in prison. Does it actually accomplish the goal of how we want them? That is, we want people who we can reintegrate into society, having experienced remorse for what they did and then be forgiven and then live the straight and narrow. How have we designed a prison to accomplish that? And note, we get further and further away from that because we increasingly privatize prisons. We put them into the hands of people who are only interested in the profit that they can earn from operating a prison. More on that in the corrections section as we come through. Now, the tipping point is reached when the positive aspect of crime outweigh the negative aspects. So you can see the cognitive features here. If prison is crime school and I'm being taught by people who endorse criminal behavior and supply me reasons, at some point, societal constraints become weaker and weaker, right? And criminal suggestion becomes more and more powerful. You hit that tipping point, and it would be expected to see people then endorse a life of crime and behave that way in a greater degree. And then differential association reinforcement theory, you add the operant conditioning model. And we see this in Congress now. We see people in Congress ripping us off. They're ripping us off blind. We see people in Congress with, $500 million, $800 million. Where is this money coming from? They're voting on and they're pushing through bills that enhance their own pocketbook in an illegal fashion. But they're willing to do it because the reward is so great and the penalty is perceived as being so small. So anytime we operate in a situation where I believe that the penalty is weak but the incentive is strong, then we can see greater and greater number of people will search for the incentive and not concern themselves about the penalty. Right? So, social learning theories. We should probably talk about one of the most cited people in social psychology and psychology in general, and this would be Albert Bandura. And what do we know about Bandura? Well, his most famous study that most of us know about are the Bobo doll studies. And what he did was he wanted to study aggression and how aggression is transmitted to children, as an example. And so what he does is he sets up this study that you're able to, in fact, I want to jump ahead here, right? I want to jump ahead, and I'll explain it all. we set up a playroom, and so Bandura's got this playroom set up, and it's got a one-way mirror. So what happens is we have an adult, and the model is randomly assigned to play aggressively in the playroom or play nicely. Right, so those are the two conditions. Now, children one at a time observe the adult, either being aggressive or being nice, and then when the adult is finished playing, the adult leaves, and then the child's allowed to go into play. The idea is, the ultimate question was, will children mimic aggressive adult behavior when they have their chance in the playroom having observed the aggressive adult? And what Bandura found is, sure shit, they do. They are more likely to imitate aggression. And you say, well, you know, that's interesting, but is that any different than the old cliche of monkey see, monkey do? That people imitate each other. What has that contributed to social psychology, or psychology more largely? Well, the deal is, what we see though is they're more likely to display the same aggressive behavior, and that confirms the mimicry aspect. But he also observed children more likely to adopt novel ways to aggress in the aggression condition. So we see the picture of the adult, and this adult then hit Bobo with a toy hammer, knocked Bobo over, threw Bobo across the room, kicked Bobo, sat on Bobo while smacking Bobo in the face, and this little darling right below her went in and did the exact same thing. And you go, oh, look at that. Our mimicry hypothesis is supported. We're well on our way to publishing, because that's what, you know, social psychologists do. But then, as they're watching, something unexpected occurs. This little girl goes over, picks up a different toy. In fact, she picked up a Barbie doll. And they said, well, I guess the girl is tired of brutalizing Bobo. She's now going to play Barbie, right? But she doesn't play Barbie. She picks up Barbie, she looks at Barbie, she walks over and she starts whipping Bobo across the face with Barbie. This is not something the adult did. And this is huge, because what this then begins to demonstrate, has been confirmed in many other studies, is that when a child observes aggression, they observe how to aggress. But they also then begin to understand that, in this case, aggression could be fun, right? Or aggression might be a way to solve problems. And if, you know, children observe their parents hitting as a way to solve problems, spanking, etc., then we come away with this conceptual idea that aggression can be fun, or aggression has its place, aggression is useful, right? And then, once you have aggression is cool or aggression is useful, then children find new ways to aggress, because that's the creative aspect of us. So we're not just automatons that mimic what we've observed. We are creative beings that then use the concept of aggression to impel us to create new forms, new creative ways to aggress against others. So social learning theory. Note that operant conditioning says, I will do something more because I'm rewarded. And that's a direct relationship from behavior to reward. Note that social learning theory extended that to the idea that we can watch this adult have fun and indirectly learn to do the same thing. So think about it. Behavioral learning is the direct path to behavior. Social learning is an indirect path. And that's why Bandura's work is so important, because it really took behaviorism and the direct learning approach and then said, yes, we agree, and look what else is possible, indirect learning. So what happens if I watch people embezzle money and get away with it? I watch people embezzle money and live the life. I have indirectly been programmed to potentially do the same thing to earn the same rewards. Okay? So it's a profound, profound contribution, and this is why Bandura is so universally cited for these ideas. More social learning theory. Then, what do we see as an outcome? Abusive parents are more likely to have been abused as children. So if I've been spanked, and my parents, you know, my mom spanked me, right, when I was bad. It was just my mom and I. That's my mom and dad were divorced, but my mom, on occasion, would spank me, and it was very ritualistic, you know. But what that teaches me, I walk away from that, oh, maybe I shouldn't do that because I'll get spanked. But it also teaches me, boy, when I'm having a problem with something, one solution or the ultimate solution then is to get physical with them. And I don't know that that's necessarily a lesson that we want to teach our children. But, many of us have been the victim of the belt. My mom was the wooden coat hanger. I know some of you get hit by a wooden spoon or the belt, or really old school, go out in back of the barn and cut your own switch to get your ass beat or whatever it is. Let us, say, I'm not saying don't do that, but what I'm saying is one of the consequences is we do, in fact, through indirect learning, teach our children that violence somehow has a place in shaping behavior. And maybe that's not some place we want to go. Kids who are spanked are more aggressive than kids who are not because they learn violence is a problem-solving technique. Now, let's talk about blowing this up in kind of a bigger picture of the culture of honor. And aggression is an acceptable way to defend one's honor. And we know that in the United States, if we go back to the 1700s, we see that if you talk shit to me and you talk shit to me in a public place, I may say, I demand satisfaction, and then in the morning we're out on the dueling grounds. And we may duel to the death for me to restore my honor. That honor became that important, right? Well, is this really a thing? And it was then. Is it still? Well, I want to introduce you to Dick Nisbett. And Dick Nisbett there is on the lower image in the blue shirt. Dick Nisbett is like the leading cross-cultural researcher that social psychology generated over its time. At least one of the leading. And Dove Cohen. So the younger guy losing his hair there. I know, what a bad way to describe someone, right? And Dove Cohen. What happens? Dove Cohen is Dick Nisbett's graduate student. Dick Nisbett at the time was up at the University of Michigan. I've met Nisbett a couple times, and Cohen I've met, but that was at Champaign-Urbana when I was thinking about going to graduate school there. I've also met Nisbett at OSU Social Psychology, which is an interesting story in and of itself, which I'll save for later. But Cohen is a Southern boy, and he gets up to University of Michigan. It's his first semester working as a graduate student with Dick Nisbett. And after he's been in Michigan a little while, Cohen goes to Nisbett. It seems like Northern men seem to be kind of wussy. They don't seem to stand up for themselves like Southern men do, the guys I grew up with. And Nisbett's going, really? Because he's a good social psychologist and he's a cross-cultural psychologist, so he's saying, is there a difference in the culture in the South and the North, which most of us would, respond probably. And they set up a series of experiments. And what they demonstrated was that when students from the South who were up at University of Michigan, right, were insulted, they would respond more aggressively than Northern males did. And the measure of aggression was they would be working together with another participant, and they were able to, when they got angry, designate how many teaspoons of hot sauce the person would have to eat. And the Southern males made the person eat more teaspoons of hot sauce than the Northern males. Studying aggression in the laboratory is tricky, right? Because you can't just promote fist fights or have gunfights in the laboratory. You're going to lose your participants very quickly. So you have to develop other measures. One is delivering electrical shocks, teaspoons of hot sauce, right? And they don't have to be real electrical shocks. They can simply just be bogus electrical shocks. But let's move on to the social labeling perspective then. Deviance is caused by labels attached to behaviors. Once labeled a criminal, people might tend to act that way. Right? And for any of you who maybe, and there's probably not many of you, right? But I know when I was in school, I was kind of labeled a troublemaker. And because I was labeled a troublemaker, then that put more eyes on me. They would watch. You got to watch that Polifroni kid because he can be trouble, right? So they're more likely to watch you than somebody else. And if you're being watched more often, it's more likely that any infractions might be detected, all else being equal, right? And so it kind of then puts you into the cycle where you are repeatedly punished and kind of labeled. How does it work? Well, and I'll say, this can't maybe explain why people become criminals in the first place, but maybe it can, and I don't know. So let's look at the general model of self-fulfilling prophecy. We put a label on someone, right? And let's say we label a child in school as a dumbass, right? And then we have low expectations for their performance, right? And that action and then reaction, if I ask a question and my dumbass labeled student gets it wrong, I say, well, you know, they got it wrong because they're a dumbass, and I don't need to invest any more time in them at this point. And that becomes my response, right? And then they're allowed to remain a dumbass, and that confirms the label. But let's suppose that a child is labeled as gifted, and then that develops a whole new set of expectations, and I ask them a question and they get it wrong. Let's say I ask them the same question I asked a dumbass, right? And both students get it wrong. The dumbass gets it wrong. The gifted child gets it wrong. But notice how my behavior might change with the gifted child. I say, well, they must not have understood the question. Or maybe if we work through this a little bit better, then they can answer that question correctly. So I might spend more energy or more effort with the gifted child than I do the dumbass, right? And then eventually the gifted child gets the answer correct. And I say, see, they're gifted. So it really isn't them, it's my behavior that largely reinforces the use of the label. And so it might go with criminal behavior as well. Now, related concepts to this, and this is one of the central core areas of analysis in social psychology, is stereotyping. And if you can take the stereotyping and prejudice class here at Ohio State offered by the Social Psychology Department, I recommend you do. This is one of the leading institutions, right? Ohio State Social Psychology is one of the leaders in the research of stereotyping, prejudice, and also attitudes and persuasion. So if you can take any classes in those areas, you really are participating in the social psychology legacy of research in this world. And note that OSU social psychology, and I'm sure I've told you this before, maybe I didn't. I'm confused because I'm having to redo this second half of the lecture due to sound problems in the first taping. But social psychology at OSU, the graduate school, is always ranked in the top 5 across the country. And last year it was ranked number 1. Right? So avail yourself of social psychology department courses if you can, because they're going to be awesome, I guarantee it. Stereotyping, hey, we look at a group, we put a person in this group, and we know, well, because they're in the group, they're likely to behave this way. Now, image theory just blows this up into an international level, into a geopolitical level, and I'm mentioning for that, for you political science majors or minors, you might have had to had the opportunity to take a class with Dr. Rick Herman, who has done significant research in image theory. And by looking at a country and the way they behave, then we craft an image for that, and it affects how we behave towards them in the future. All this, though, whether stereotyping or images, lead to maintenance of stories that justify behavior towards the group. And I did a lot of research when I was in graduate school on white supremacist groups and how they communicate on the internet and how they create images of others and craft narratives thus to support their hatred of other people. No, I'm not a big fan of white supremacists, let me assure you. Right? Nazis even less. Right? So all this can lead to racial profiling, but on the other hand, perhaps not. So let's get to homework 3. And what I'd like you to do then is welcome to our academic hypothesis imaginarium. Boy, that's a mouthful. For the following 4 crimes, here's what's going to happen. Offer a different theoretical explanation for each crime. So we've gone through in this lecture a whole bunch of different theories of crime. Now is your opportunity to apply them to different crimes. And what I want to do is increase your cognitive flexibility as a result of this exercise. So you see a crime and you say, well, that crime could be explained by this theory thusly, but it could be explained by another theory in a different way, right? So it's not that one theory is right and not one theory is wrong. Now, some theories might apply more easily, more readily, and be better supported by the evidence for certain crimes than others. And that's kind of the nuances that I want you to tease out as moving through this process. So we got our 4 theories of crime, remember, and there's the sociological, and this could be either subcultural or structural, and when you say, I want to use a sociological theory to explain, please indicate whether you're going subcultural or structural, right? Be sure to specifically indicate which, and you'll see where. Can you offer a biological explanation? Can you offer a psychological explanation? And notice there was a whole bunch of subcategories that you can apply there. Or finally, the 4th category, the social psychological. So what is it? For each team member, respond to each crime for 4 responses per team member. Each team member must use each of the 4 theoretical explanations. So you got 4 theoretical explanations. I'm going to give you 4 crimes, right? So use this explanation for this crime, a different explanation for that crime, different explanation for that crime, and finally, as an individual, you'll use the 4th explanation for the 4th crime. So you're going to have to go through and determine which one you like best. But here is the rub, as Shakespeare would say in Hamlet. There's the rub. You can't duplicate. So if Annika uses the biological theory for the crime of vandalism, it's off limits for the rest of you. So for vandalism, you'll all have to adopt a different theory, right? So this is going to require some communication and conversation between you. Here's what it looks like. You'll get a template to fill out as part of the homework assignment. I hope we're getting used to that kind of way of doing things, and I hope it helps you. Your first and last name go here, and when you turn in, when you have your name on something, I want your last name as well as your first name. Remember, there's 160 people in this class. So if you say, Lucy said, and I'm like, what Lucy? And please don't make me look through the whole list of people to try and figure that shit out. We all have first and last names. In this context, it's best that we use both, right? So I think this might be hypothesized cause implied by blank theory. This is what I need to know to support my hypothesized cause. And notice, this is where we get into the needs assessment and kind of the critical thinking element. What do I need to know to support this contention? So let's look at an honest God example. So I, Quincy the cat, Polifrone, think this might be hypothesized cause implied by psychological psychodynamic flavor theory. Attacking a symbol of another sexuality because of repressed sexual conflict, potential display of defense mechanisms of reaction formation. So here the crime was vandalism. Your imagination says this was someone who tore down a rainbow flag, and then I say, why did they tear down that rainbow flag? Well, they're attacking a symbol of someone's sexuality, right? And Sigmund Freud especially would say they're doing that because of their repressed sexual conflict, right? And this is the potential display of this defense mechanism of reaction formation. So what do I need to know to support that contention? Is there any information, any evidence that might help support? Well, what I might know then is, do interviewed suspects present with repressed sexual conflicts? And if I see that, then it lends evidence to my proper application of that theory. Okay? So you just work through this. You got to do 4, one each for 4 different crimes, right? So let's try another one. Different theory. This is still vandalism. I, Desi Doodlebug, think this might be a hypothesized cause implied by social psychological theory. Attacking the monument, so someone has now attacked a monument, right? Attacking the monument due to the presence of others doing the same. And this is kind of a peer pressure phenomenon that would exist or be a social psychological explanation. This is what I need to know to add support. One thing I might want to know is, were there others present during the commission of the crime, and did the suspect appear to be following their example? And if that occurred, then it supports my theory, my social psychological theory, for the reason for the observed vandalism. No right or wrong answers here, folks. Just think it through, and what course assistant or I, whoever grades this assignment, will be looking for is your thinking it through. Okay? And then we're going to have a little table on there that's going to say, hey, who did what? And so you got the team member number 1, right? You're going to put your name in there. And then what theory did you use for arson? What theory did you use for drunk driving? What theory did you use for killing a U.S. Capitol police officer? Yeah, I'm going there. And what theory did you use to describe shoplifting? So basically, we got 4 team members, and they're going to offer each a different explanation for each of the 4 crimes. So you get to offer all 4 explanations and your team members. So you got to negotiate that shit out, and I'm hoping this inspires some conversation between you. Okay? So if you have any questions about this assignment, what are you going to do? I hope to see you in our class meeting, right? So that you can ask questions, or office hours, and we'll get that squared away. It's especially important that some of you bring questions to the weekly class Zoom meeting, which I will record as long as you remind me and I don't frickin' forget, but that you do that, and then it's available to people who aren't able to attend because of their work or their familial caregiving obligations or what have you. So let's wrap this lecture up, finally, right? Here's a synthesis, at least an attempt. So the theories of crime, what do we know? Well, there's sociological theories, and what might be our buzz sentence for that? Well, people don't kill people. Societies, governments, and reward structures do. So it's those social forces that operate on people, according to the sociologists. Right. Okay, biological theories. It's all about the brain and hormones, so figure that shit out and you got your answer, right? I know that's an oversimplification, but this is supposed to be somewhat glib. Psychological theories, nope, people do kill people. At least certain kinds of people do. And note, with a lot of psychological theories, we're trying to put people into categories and then say categorically this behavior should be observed to a greater extent. And then, the gold standard, right, the best, and I'm just saying that because I'm a social psychologist and I'm inflexibly biased. Yeah, people do kill people, at least some people do, sometimes when the conditions are perfectly right and they've been taught or told to. And speaking to most social psychologists is absolutely exhausting because they're the champions of depends, and then you ask depends on what, and they give you a whole list of shit that it depends on, and you're sorry you ever asked, right? So, okay, so an integrative model then, what are we talking? No one factor explains it all, and let's make that one of our chief takeaway points. There's not one single explanation. There's multiple explanations, and as critical thinkers and good scientists, we figure out how to gather the evidence so we elevate the probability of one explanation being more correct than necessarily another. We have to consider antecedent predispositions. That is, what's going on in the person as they begin their life of crime. Maybe this is a good time to invoke biological explanations or brain differences. Right? What's happening to a child who has suffered fetal alcohol syndrome in learning moral development or learning how to behave in a classroom? Right? Or the psychological personality intelligence, right? If someone is born a psychopath, what does that mean? And note that a lot of people don't want to even countenance the idea that one is born a psychopath, because then what do we do with these children who are that's a huge dilemma in and of itself, right? Or maybe it's intelligence or some other factor. Environmental. So this is, kind of a spin-off on sociological, is social class, family history, neighborhoods, and how do they affect the growing child. And then the early indicators, when we start to see behavior begin to stabilize, right? When we get to age 7, 8 through early teens, tweens behavior, age domain, what happens? Do we see evidence of bullying, aggression, or conduct disorder? And one I've left off this list because I hate it, but is cruelty to animals. And if someone can be cruel to an animal, this is really a wake-up call. If they take pleasure in torturing animals, we have to step back and say, you're taking pleasure in hurting. That's sadism. And some people might excuse and say, well, that's just an animal. Well, that's true. It's just an animal now. But if someone delights in harming something else, we have to step back and say, where is this going to lead? What might this mean, right? So, but then note, we have to be careful because violent adults are almost invariably were violent kids, but violent kids often do not grow up to be violent adults, right? And often abused children do not grow up to abuse others. So let us be careful not to spin the causal link in the wrong direction there. But so as we move through this integrative model, what about developmental processes or intensifying factors in observed criminal behavior? To what extent do the schools, family, media play a role? And notice this is largely sociological or social psychological. Modeling peer pressure, and that's getting to be pretty much straight up social psychological. Alcohol and substance abuse, right? And these often for their disinhibiting factors. And then maintenance factors. How do, let's say, the effect of short-term rewards versus long-term costs cause people to hit that tipping point where criminal behavior becomes appealing, right? To what extent do bad environments facilitate the criminal behavior? And the long-term costs kick in, making reoffense more likely, and that is if someone, and I always hated this when I was at Columbus State, you can imagine a student comes in to ask me about their future and applying to schools, etc., and I say, okay, so you sound good, you look good on paper, but you're concerned. What's your concern? And finally they admit to me, I've got a felony. I got a felony conviction. To what extent does that then affect their future trajectory? And should it, right? And that's an issue to consider. So I'm going to leave you with this idea. Are we manufacturing social distress? In a world in which social institutions can't function effectively, right, the best way to succeed is by numbing oneself to the dissociation, numbing oneself for the dissociation process accomplished, then combined with this prevailing social conditions to produce psychopathic-like behavior on a greater and greater scale. And this comes to us from Robert Reber. He was a profiler, a criminal profiler in his book Manufacturing Social Distress. And this is a super social, psychological, and sociological argument that maybe we're creating an environment, right, that supports worse and worse behavior. And what the hell can we do about it? So I want to leave you with that. That's the end of the theories of crime. You got homework 3. Like my old boss Chuck said, ever onward, guys.